the Lord loves all nations. He loves Germany. He loves all nations.
And he wants
loves
them
America.
to be more like Christ.
Right. He's placed us in particular nations to work for their well-being, to show concrete, tangible expressions of love, like my family, like my neighborhood, like my particular city, like my state, like my nation, and then, of course, to the ends of all nations.
Welcome back to the Grimké Review of Books. Good to have you all here. I'm Joe Holland. We've got Doug Ponder, Brian Laughlin.
Glad to be here.
A pile of books in front of us, as usual.
Is this going to be a 2-hour episode, 3 hours?
It looks to be more even than that.
Well, I think it's probably, some people have responded, at least the first episode, like you didn't go deep enough into that book. And that's really the purpose. We're not trying to. That's not the pattern
we're going to
setting.
fulfill all those prophecies on this one, then. We definitely won't go deep enough on all these books.
All these books. These are not props. All these books actually pertain to the topic at hand. But no pastor does that. Pastors are constantly in dialogue with different books, and you read different parts, and you read an audiobook, and you skim a book. And so we're trying to show that you, as a pastor, when you deal with issues, you're going to be in dialoage with different books.
That's right. Yeah. A lot of this is meant to be an overview survey. Like you said, you're dialoguing with books. How do you appropriate these? Right. These are point of reference. A lot of books you're going to read. I think it's maybe at this point, 10 to 1 on most books I read. I'm like, I don't really like that. That's not that great. Right. And then one, I'm like, this one's wonderful.
When you first started reading, right after you became a Christian,
everyone was
the other way around. Every book was amazing.
That's right. You're underlining
I have no field of reference.
Everything in the book. You get like half the book underlined.
I read somewhere that if you're marking up like more than 10% of a book, it's not a sign that the book is amazing, but that you're not a particularly amazing reader.
Yes. You're in the sponge phase. Like every book I read as a new Christian.
This one up.
Right.
So
I basically, my theology changed with every book.
Look how many pages you've dog-eared there.
That's a
and
lot
you
of
have
dog
tabs?
I have tabs for
and
chapters.
They're color-coded.
Color-coded for chapters. I have dog ears for ones that I need to return. And then reverse dog ear if you have to tab the other side.
That is very
tab the front.
All things done decently and in order.
And then written in with a Blackwing 602.
Wow.
The right kind of pencil.
That is a great pencil. I will give you that.
Yep.
Wow. I do dog ears. I don't do tabs. Tabs are extremely, shockingly offensive. I just don't understand them. They're very strange.
Look what they do visually.
They look like flags.
I ran out of tabs. And when you get like a batch of 5 packets of tabs, there's always a bad tab in there. And so if I'm using something like this, it means I'm running low.
No.
And this was just all I had.
No
and
tabs.
These are awful.
I don't buy batches of tabs.
I use an erasable pen because I've read online that similar to
erasable pen,
why pencils are better for when people write. You've probably heard this before. I know you don't love it, but brain science shows when people are writing with some kind of permanent thing, it affects the way they write. So anyway,
so is that why you're wishy-washy on a lot of things? Because nothing is concrete for you. This is unfortunate.
So erasable pen. Secondly, a system for it's a key sentence, key idea. It's underlined. It's a key paragraph. Brackets and a star. Okay. All right. If it's a key page, and you could have all these things on one page, right? A key paragraph with an absolutely critical idea. Idea is underlined. Paragraph is bracketed. But if the whole page is great or among the greatest, then that one gets dog-eared.
We need to get a picture from your book and just do a pop-up on the video.
What I don't want to do is dog-ear 37 pages in there because then they start stacking out. The book gets weird. You can't actually find them all.
It's wonderful. I've got probably...
What's absurd is you have a photographic memory. So all of that's futility because you already know what page it's on. It doesn't even make any sense. Well, it's hilarious.
It actually does have photographs.
I have wondered if doing all that is what actually helps me remember it. Like I remember marking a specific quote and then I'm like, that's the bottom of page 93.
Okay.
In that
I'll
book.
mark quotes. My go-to is a star. But it's not complicated. I don't have a very well thought through system. I will dog ear things.
Are you consistent though?
It's changed over the years.
Okay.
And I don't know what the pattern is.
Consistent within a single book.
It's more of an impact thing that I do. Like this impacted me. Let me do something.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I dog eared it. Then I made a star. Or then I put LOL.
Well, you remember the page because it's almost like you're putting artwork on there, which means that page looks unique to any other page you've read. Right. So you can go back and say, oh yeah, that's the pattern on that page.
Well, my wife used to do red pins. I need
stickers then, Joe. I mean, you're tabs. I can just get stickers.
My wife used to do
share some.
red pins with squiggly underlines. And I was like, hey, this has got to stop. I was like, I know there's only a few number of things in marriage that are not sin that you're allowed to like spin these bullets on. Yeah. But if we're going to be reading the same books, this is one of the ones
red underlines.
Wow. Squiggly red underlines. I can't do it.
Paige and I, we just embrace buying separate books. It helps everybody.
We have separate books.
We got redundancy.
We're reading books too. My wife and I.
Yeah, it's better for everybody.
A big book budget there.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's
on the right
better.
things.
It's cheaper than the counseling. So it just it just depends how you look at it.
It's great.
So where are we starting today on this topic of nationalism for Christians?
I think we should start with nations.
Okay, nations.
Yeah, they're actually a thing
in general. Okay,
right.
I like that. I like actually starting with James Baird's book though. Personally, the reason, we're thinking about, how do we help people in a small rate in this conversation?
Sure.
This one, he provides a very simple argument and primer into the conversation that I think helps Christians that are just beginning to think about the topic put pieces together.
Isn't that
which he deals with nations and everything, of course.
Isn't that part of why he wrote the book?
Yes.
I mean, doesn't he say pretty early on in the book that part of the reason it came into existence is that until pretty recently,
2023, he actually says.
Oh yeah, just a few years ago.
Yeah, not too long ago.
He hadn't really thought through this subject and
not as thoroughly as he'd like.
Correct.
And
so he's a bright man.
He's a PCA pastor in Florida.
Many.
So being a PCA pastor, trained in Reformed theology as it comes through the Westminster Confession and was mediated through mainly Southern Presbyterianism. So he definitely was, being ordained PCA pastor, familiar, but he says this was getting up to speed on all this stuff. And he says in the beginning that he's writing this book to himself 2 years ago.
That's correct. Yeah. Which I think a lot of Christians find themselves in that similar circumstance over the last decade, maybe especially the past 6 years, post 2020, of course, a lot of social circumstances have shifted. And therefore, Christians are asking a lot of different questions because the circumstances have changed. So even guys that are very learned, like James, of course, is saying, well, these circumstances are forcing my hand to reevaluate how I've thought about Christ, nations, government, Christian witness, public service, civil authorities, the church, ecclesiology, church's role, the gospel witness, church, all of these things I think get refocused. So I love the book for that because he says I reevaluated most of it and actually ended up going almost in a 180 the other direction.
And pastors should cut themselves some slack. I think we have the view of the perfect pastor who just has this exhaustive categorical memory of all topics.
He emerges from the womb with all knowledge.
And that just isn't all of us are I kind of know about that, but I need to study more because that's now an issue.
Yeah. That's a side too, but to be a pastor who's thriving, you need to be virtuous and continually learning.
Sure.
So that's the humility piece of saying there's a lot of things I have studied. Yeah. I think I've reached some conclusions, but I'm still striving dearly to learn. During a lot of this season, especially regarding a lot of these issues, I think too many pastors are embracing too much sunk cost. Mm-hmm. So they're just saying, I've been here for years, and I've been teaching a certain way of thinking about things. So I'm not going to reevaluate things. I'm just going to double down uncritically. Right. And I don't think that's the way forward at any point in life. No. Uncritical double down.
I don't want to move away from Baird. I know that there's a lot more we can say about his book, which I thought was really good, clear, helpful, wonderfully brief.
Yeah.
But to the point you just made about the need for pastors to be learning, and then also the kind of humility to say, I don't really know. Yeah. I haven't read much on this. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate, but I find maybe not just pastors, but perhaps especially pastors who have this sense of I ought to be a knowledgeable authority or expert on certain subjects, especially the closer they are to God's word. That kind of humility is lacking. I know dozens of men personally, and I witness hundreds upon thousands of men who share my profession on the internet who have strong thoughts about Christian nationalism, and they can't even define what it is.
Right.
And if you have a strong thought about something without even being able to articulate accurately what that thing is, then you don't actually have an informed opinion. What you have is a situation in which you have been the subject of propaganda and somebody has whipped you into a frenzy to be against a label and you don't even recognize what the content is supposed to be that goes into that label.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's just part and parcel of the times because we live in times of strong thoughts with weak justification. Mm-hmm. So they tend to be strong thoughts, thin thoughts. Mm-hmm. So a lot of folks are, they're emotional tropes that people hold to. And a lot of folks, unfortunately, haven't critically thought at deeper levels about these things.
Right.
Which would include basic things like, well, let's define our terms.
Sure.
let's talk in a civil manner about the subject matter that we're inquiring about. Yeah. And understand how others have thought about it. I mean, just basics of evaluating a subject matter tends to go missing in our society. Yeah. Pastors should not be like that.
I mean, just really quickly. So we're not accused of being guilty of that. As we were chatting before beginning this episode, you reminded me that
I thought we just turned the cameras on and just kind of
we
just ad hoc.
Yeah, we're breaking the fourth wall here, letting everybody know. We do read these books, and then we do have conversations together.
I think somebody accused us of not reading the books, which I did like. It was more of they didn't like the conclusions that we were reaching about the books we read.
Yeah,
and I would say, I think that's okay. Right. We don't always have to agree.
And this is not going to be the case for the vast majority of books we read. But in the last episode, we were dealing with something that I did an entire doctoral thesis on, and so of course I read these books. They're of great interest to me, and of course I have a thought about them because I wrote a 230-page thesis on this. Right. Whatever. Yeah. Anyway, so to defining terms, just very quickly, you reminded me before we turn the cameras on that it says in Acts 17:26 that God made from one man every nation. Right. Ethne is a Greek word there. Can also be translated people. Every nation that lives upon the face of the earth. And it's just worth pointing out that means that nations are part of God's economy for how the world is organized.
That's right.
Okay. And so it begins with a family. You can look at Abraham. We could do Adam, but the flood comes in, kind of shakes things up, and then people go their own ways. But let's just start with Abraham. It starts with a family. By the time you get to Genesis 13:14, that family has become a clan. You've got hundreds of fighting men, and each of them would have had a family who are with Abraham. He's got enough men in his clan at that point. He's only got one son. Yeah. So those guys are not related to him by blood, and yet they're part of his overall clan, and they're going off to fight against all those kings. And then he eventually has this grandson who has 12 sons, and each of them forms a tribe, and then those tribes collectively form a nation. So you see this kind of families, clans, tribes, nations, this kind of growth. And so the Bible affirms that as an organizing principle for how we think about the world. So that's what how we think about the place of nations.
Yeah, how God has made the world is organized around nations.
That's right.
If folks haven't read Yoram Hazony's book, The Virtue of Nationalism,
it's good.
It's a great primer into how to think about how God has organized the world.
That's right.
So he provides great categories. It essentially boils down to three. You have full anarchy, which is kind of like loose tribalism. Mm-hmm. You have nations that are organized with a common identity under a common government, or you have essentially empire. Mm-hmm. And empire is a totalitarian, totalizing system, and much like a globalist emphasis in terms of one world, one government, one people, without differentiations in terms of cultures and identities and governments.
That's right.
So nations are eviscerated.
Yes,
which creates a totalitarian, comprehensive system.
One of the factors is important. I mean, we talked about what a nation is. A lot of people don't know what nationalism is. And if they have heard the word, they probably associate it with Adolf Hitler. But while his form of nationalism would fall under the broad umbrella, that would be like saying that all soda is Coca-Cola just because Coca-Cola happens to be a kind of soda. Mm-hmm. That's a horrific fallacy, and people who think this way just show how ignorant they are. What nationalism is the idea that because nations are part of how the world is organized, each nation should be free to chart its own course without interference from the outside, telling them how they must live, what they must do, without eviscerating those common identities that you talked about. So a much simpler way to say this would be nationalism is the recognition that a nation is not just an idea. It's not just a geopolitical entity. It is also it is a group of people who have a shared, or as you said, a common identity that would include shared history, shared language, shared customs, shared values, shared laws, shared loyalties, and yes, a shared religion. And then you even see baked into the scriptures a kind of nudging toward this understanding and why it would be helpful. In Deuteronomy 4, just before Moses gives the 10 Commandments for a second time to that new generation who's come on the other side of the 40 years of the wilderness wandering, he says in Deuteronomy 4, let me tell you how you should think about these laws. And he's got this wonderful section, I think it's verse 8, where he says that if you carefully follow these things, other nations will see you and will say, what a great and wise nation this is, And what kind of nation has a God so near to them as this nation does? So one of the virtues of a nationalistic way of looking at the world is recognizing those loyalties, those common identities, they're present. If you try to eviscerate them, it actually becomes a totalizing system that's bad for everybody. But if you recognize them, it would actually allow two nations to exist next to each other, and one of them to be vastly superior in its culture, in its customs, in its values, in its laws, in its religion, and that other nation's able to look at it, and just as other nations could look at Israel and say, what makes you so great and so wise?
Right.
And then you're able to say, let me tell you.
That's right.
Let me tell you.
So then all these things are necessary to achieve what most people self-evidently or intuitively affirm.
Of course.
We want peace amongst men. We want harmony,
general prosperity.
Yep. We want unity.
Right. Armies to defend borders.
Yeah. So it requires all of these things to be shared in terms of identity that we have in common laws, common culture, common language. Language is basic because we cannot communicate towards the proper goals of building one another up or unity without being able to communicate. This just makes sense. So the Tower of Babel in the scriptures, everybody was building a city with a name unto themselves. God said, well, this is not good. Let's just, go down and confuse their languages. They'll be successful and ultimately make a name for themselves and not worship the name that they should worship. Mm-hmm. And so therefore they were all dispersed. The big building project, everybody walked away because they just couldn't communicate it anymore. And that just makes sense. Right. So you can't have unity amongst nations without those sorts of things in common.
It isn't just a divine watchmaker idea that the Lord set up this principle and then just let it run. And so in any organization, any nation, any church, you have people who come into power and leave power. And we see in Daniel 2 and also Romans 13, God very specifically saying, I'm the one who sets up and removes. I'm the one who gives all authority actively.
Right.
So if someone has authority over a nation, somebody is ruling, it is by God's sovereign, current, active work.
Right. Yes. He's a lot of the statements in Scripture are also they contain a descriptive and prescriptive element that needs to be considered. So God is sovereign over all of history. He's sovereign over all of nations. He's also the one that establishes all nations at all times and places. So descriptively, that's what he does. But prescriptively, he defines what every nation should be striving after, what every government is established by him to accomplish.
That's right.
So as you said, it's not an arbitrary kind of set in motion deistically, and this is kind of how people organize themselves. He's established nations for a particular purpose according to his purposes, and nations only thrive or fulfill what they exist for if they actually are in accordance with what he's established them to do.
That's right. And that gets us to the Christian part of the label Christian nationalism. We define a nation, right, as a collection of families, clans, and tribes who have a shared or common identity consisting in laws and values and customs and history and language and religion and value and all of these things. Nationalism is a system of government that recognizes those things are part of the common good. They're part of the world. And it's actually good to recognize them, not to squash them, because it contributes to a greater sense of unity, or solidarity is the word that's often used. Christian nationalism would then say, right, and therefore part of what would make the best nation would be one that explicitly recognizes the lordship of Jesus and seeks to pass laws and values and instill values and customs and all these things that actually would honor Jesus, the Lord, the King of all kings, in a way that happens at every level and is actually good for those who live there.
Now, I think a lot of Christians, especially pastors or just Christians today, especially in our context, get very nervous at how quick you got to that conclusion. So this is what I like about James's book, because he essentially says, well, God's the one who establishes governments. All governments are to seek the public good. Religion.
So that's Romans 13:1 is your proof text for the first premise.
That's right. Yeah, unpack it a little bit, because it does
Peter,
give clear.
2, is it 13 or 14 is the second premise.
That's right.
And then what's the conclusion?
Yeah. So in those passages, as we know, as governments are established to uphold what God declares as righteous and just and good for all people. So it's on his terms, according to his standards, his laws, his commandments. He's the one who gets to define it. And the standard for success for all governments or governing authorities is to the degree that they actually uphold what God establishes. So they're not laws unto themselves, where God just sets people in motion. You can just arbitrarily do what you want to do. There are standards that must be upheld.
Because there is a King of Kings.
Right. There is a King of Kings.
Right.
So all governments exist to uphold the public good. Religion is a necessary component of any public good. There has to be something that we worship beside ourselves. There has to be something above us that we strive to actually conform to actually live our lives to. So, and there's not a nation in all of human history that has actually existed or thrived without a proper understanding of how religion fits into that. So people have to worship. There has to be a higher authority in which we submit and conform our lives to in terms of defining what life's about.
It's a very clean syllogism. All government is instituted by God. It's straight from the Bible, Romans 13:1. The job of a government is to promote what is good and punish what is evil. That's 1 Peter 2. Therefore, the best government would be one that actually knows what is good according to God and seeks to implement that.
Which therefore comes in.
I just want to meet the Christian who says, I don't agree with that.
Well, I don't think most Christians rightly who have folks that engage in patience without insightful rhetoric just sit down and say, let's just have a basic discussion. There is a God over everything. He's established the world. They're organized around nations. He establishes governments. Governments are to promote what is good according to God. Religion is part of that. The only one and true religion that all Christians know is Christianity. Christ is risen. He's conquered the tomb. He's seated at the right hand of God. He is the creator God of the Redeemer. Therefore, all other religions are false religions, misrepresentations, idolatrous, and only Christianity is the one only true religion. So all public good, if it's to be sought by governments, must uphold everything that accords with Christ. And therefore, the church exists within every nation to be the establishment of his kingdom, to constantly worship Christ and be within those nations to disciple the nations to obey all that Christ commanded. And that includes all governing authorities. See this in Psalm 2 is very, very clear that all nations, all rulers are to kiss the Son, submit to him because he has all authority.
He says, kings, be wise.
That's right.
And so he's not just speaking to regular people, although regular people would be included by extension. He specifically, as you just pointed out, mentions rulers of nations and tells them that they should kiss the Son. Or else God's wrath will be quickly kindled, and blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Yeah, and you see this throughout, both Old and New Testament. You do. They speak to all of these things, right? Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. So therefore, we submit to him. I mean, these are very clear. They came proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, that Christ is King of Kings, that his kingdom and his rulership needs to affect every area of life and every person in life, and therefore everyone, including every place and government, needs to submit to him.
Absolutely.
So Christians, I think, good faith, genuine Christians who love God's word, this makes sense if you sit down and talk about it. Problem is normally we get into discussion through some reels or through an experience, and somebody got a bad taste in their mouth, or somebody they saw promoting some labels or concepts, and they seem mean, and therefore they disassociate that whole concept because they just didn't like the person who was presenting it. So there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of heat. There's not so there could be a lot more clarity at this point that's needed. And so pastors need to be aware of
which has been good. I mean, I was introduced to the topic of Christian nationalism and was like, well, yeah. Why wouldn't that be true? I mean, I love Calvin's.
I love how you just let the label stick real fast. You just go with it.
I had to backtrack and say, well, why would people be angry at that? I mean, you had read book 4 of Calvin's Institutes and him talking about it. I'm like, yes, the American experiment. Some of these things look different, and some of them are jacked up, and some of them are fine. But I realized if you're coming at it from looking at nationalism, and people automatically say, if you're a nationalist, then you are this label. And those kind of power mongers want to use any religion they can get their hands on, at least right now, Christianity, to try and accrue power and do the really bad, wicked things. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not that.
Right. I'm not that. Yeah.
I'm just, Jesus is king. And God sets up all rulers, and he wants all nations to rule to his glory. And every king should kiss the Son, unless he be angry. I'm like, Why is this a problem?
Yeah. I think not a lot of times we don't necessarily think through those categories. So you can go the other route, if you will, which I think, especially in I think the evangelical American church landscape. I thought about my education through a lot of the formal theological studies for a long time. Been studying for the last 20 years. Many of these things. But there wasn't a particular emphasis on any Christian social teaching.
That's true. Me either.
So the primary focus was a survey of Christian history and systematic doctrines and biblical teachings in terms of personal revival and conversion, pietistic devotion to Christ, and allegiance in some way, shape, or form to a church.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the extent. And of course, it had impact on your families and changed your personal life where you were more virtuous in a lot of ways, Christ-like, those sorts of things.
Right. Which is why books like this are more of a retrieval. Protestant social ethic. These have come out in the past. This is out in the past 5-7 years.
It's great. Yeah. Brad Littlejohn was one of the primary editors, Protestant Social Teaching. This is an introduction. So folks that haven't, soireed into the whole discussion, it's great because it gives a great survey of how Christians have thought throughout the Protestant tradition about governance, nations, God's authority, how and how the church has responded to those things.
But this publisher and editor heard your story and was like, guys, pastors, this was not a part of their education.
Not a part of their.
But it's back in the literature. We need to revive.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. It needs to be revived. This is part of James's story. He said, oh, has anybody spoken about these things? We need to look into it. And then come to find out, actually, there's a rich, voluminous history of writing about these things and thinking richly about these things. In fact, the American landscape in terms of how it's constituted would not exist without that at all. So I remember even to your point about Luther and Calvin, like I get the students to read this in theology class, which is Luther on secular authority. And it's kind of a snippet of Calvin's on civil government. Oh, yeah. So I got the students, it's 100 guys in the room trained for pastoral ministry or pastors themselves. And I said, well, give me some thoughts about this book, and what, everybody's dead silent. Of course, given the circumstances of the landscape, you already know the context. And it was quiet for a while. One brave man in the back goes, I was like, sure, yeah, go ahead and share. And he said, to me, it just felt like Christian nationalism. And I said, well, what are you going to, what are you going to do with that? Either that means, maybe Christian nationalism is right. Have you ever thought that? Or maybe Luther and Calvin weren't wrong. Or maybe how it's defined today, we need to have a thicker discussion about these things. So
if you're going to call them wrong, then you got some work to do.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So I'm personally inclined when it comes to the label Christian nationalism to not own that in the foreground.
I agree.
That's just where
because if people can't define it, then they're going to attribute to me views I probably don't even hold.
Right.
And they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
For them, it's literally a label that they use just to say, you're bad. You're a bad man who has bad ideas. And so if you say, well, yeah, that's me, then they're like, well, you're bad.
Right.
That's it. That's about the depth of discussion that we're talking about.
Yes. Well, some
I'm
of
not exaggerating.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that's people have to embrace a little bit stronger constitution when we get into these discussions, which is some folks that associate broadly with that particular label. I would say, well, of course, there's probably unhelpful things there. There's bad things that are not helpful, right? In terms of overreaches, misrepresentations of how we might define it, how the scriptures talk about who Christ is and how actually his good news comes to all nations so that they can turn to him, submit to him, follow after his commandments. There's maybe they're overlooking means, but you have the flip side of where folks say, well, Christ has nothing to do with anything regarding those matters, and those are bad, extremely bad. In fact, even more detrimental in a lot of ways because they refuse to engage in areas that the scriptures are very clear on, and therefore harming the church itself, discipleship, the good of their neighbors. So the detrimental downstream consequences of ignoring what the scriptures teach about Christ over all things and over all governments and societies is absolutely withholding the glorious good news and work that God wants to do in the world.
Right.
We refuse to engage.
For many Christians, their political theology is whatever they've heard between the present day and the last election cycle.
Right.
And it's like, wait, we have a full Bible and we have lots of people who've written. I mean, looking at these books, I think we have 1,500 years of writing just out on this table of Christians who loved God and loved his word and have tried to think not just for their generation, but for future generations. So, Stephen Wolfe, Christian Nationalism, and one of the things he says.
That book, I mean, folks that aren't familiar with that book, when did that come out? 21? Somewhere around the 21, 22, something like that, I believe, around
But he says, do the reading. And certainly that can be pejorative, but it also can be encouraging to pastors. Like if your political theology is underdeveloped, it doesn't mean you've wasted your training. It just means, hey, maybe you need to do the reading. Like what have people thought?
Right.
There's an intellectual humility that we aren't all up to speed on everything.
Yeah. And I think embracing that as a virtue for Christians in terms of how they think about growing in their own thoughts about things. Mm-hmm. So Stephen's book had a lot of mixed reviews in terms of how people liked it, didn't like it, but is an absolutely robust part of this conversation to help clarify things, provide various fixtures in terms of pieces of the overall argument about how God relates to government, politics, social teaching, and a historical survey that says this is strongly how a lot of Protestants have thought about these things and acted historically as the church.
Exactly.
So you have to do virtuous, humble wrestling with those things, even if you don't land at the particular application criticism that he has towards the end of the book.
Sure.
I know some folks didn't like some of his rhetoric there.
I'm against seed oils, just to be clear.
I don't remember that part. I don't remember that. But Christians have thought richly about how Christ relates to governing authorities.
Yeah.
Richly.
No, they have. So coming full circle with the story that you shared about that guy who read Luther and Calvin and was shocked and was like, well, this sounds like Christian nationalism, right? There's a lot in that statement because what he's saying when he says that is, this sounds like what I've been told is wrong, immoral, harmful. So I'm shocked to hear these guys that we consider theological heroes, ancestors, say things that I've been told are wrong, immoral, and harmful. And I think that the reason that is sort of the default assumption for so many people, I was chewing on this as you guys were chatting for the last few minutes, is probably three factors. One is after World War II, because of the absolute catastrophe of Nazi Germany, right? The absolute catastrophe of what happened in that place. You had an overreaction to anything that smacked of family pride, pride in history, pride in your people, ethnicity, pride in your nation. And the idea was...
Well, some of that, I mean, I could be wrong. Some of it, I'm not that old yet, but everybody was excited about America winning. About Britain winning I mean, for a hot minute, everybody said, "Go Allies!"
Yeah, that's right.
Isn't this great?
I know.
There's been. I think that's worth. The only reason I'm bringing that up, you're exactly right. But because most Christians today, especially have the horse blinders on to the immediate reals, that they have no purview of progression and how the conversation has changed in terms of its dynamics, its emphasis, and what has been lost or resituated in that overall discussion.
So what emerged is now called the post-war consensus, which is essentially a neoliberal idea that the individual, not families, clans, tribes, and nations, but the individual is the fundamental unit of society.
That's correct.
And that therefore encouraging loyalties to family or clan or tribe or nation is harmful, wrong, and some would soften that and say, no, it's just secondary. So just to give a very simple example, ask a Christian, should you love your family more than the family across the street? And if they say no, they're both a hypocrite and they're ignorant.
Right.
Here's what I mean. I'm confident that they don't go to work every day to provide food for the family across the street at an equal level that they do for their own. So they're already a hypocrite. They're actually loving their family in tangible ways more than they're loving the family across the street.
Right.
And they're ignorant because the Bible would say, that's correct. That's the way you're supposed to do it. It doesn't mean that you hurt the family across the street. No. And when they're in need, you help to the greatest ability that you can. But what you don't do is you don't neglect your own family that God has given you.
An unbeliever.
Right? Yeah, that's 1 Timothy 5:8.
That's pretty strong.
Right.
Worse than an unbeliever, because even unbelievers get this. That's Paul's argument.
Right.
And what's insane is we now have Christians who don't get this because what has happened is a post-war consensus establishing the individual. So we talk about universal human rights instead of talking about the good of these smaller units, little platoons, I think Burke called them, Edmund Burke. So you've got families and tribes, and clans and tribes and nations. And the point is, an American should love America more than it loves Germany. There's nothing wrong with that. In the same way, I should love my wife more than I love other women. I should love my kids more than I love your kids.
And you're again, this is moving beyond theoretical statement love. Axiomatic love.
Correct.
The Lord loves all nations. He loves Germany. He loves all nations.
And he wants them to be more like Christ.
Right. He's placed us in particular nations.
Correct.
To work for their well-being.
Exactly.
To show concrete, tangible expressions of love, like my family, like my neighborhood, like my particular city, like my state, like my nation, and then, of course, to the ends of all nations.
And let me just say,
those are not in conflict, because it's not in contrast.
I know this is controversial. Let me just point out, what I just said is classic Christian teaching. Augustine says this verbatim. Aquinas says this verbatim. Right. The reformers who read both of those guys.
Althusius builds his whole book on that concept.
Yes, it's just. So as I said, you're either you're a hypocrite or ignorant or both if you can't affirm that these kinds of loyalties exist. They're real and they're actually good.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of American Christians have had a lot of this teaching. Or they just haven't heard these things. So where they realize it, to your point, is where our default is syncretistic, far secular modernism that is predicated on the individual as the primary constituting or organizing principle for societies. So the scriptures clearly don't teach those things. In fact, the way God's love comes and affects and is affirmed and felt, if you will, in everybody's lives is through these organizing principles of the family, of the church, and of course towards societies and nations, and then of course globally. So the way in which God actually establishes the world and how we relate to one another and where our responsibility for upholding and expressing his love is in and through these relationships, these relational spheres as they refer to it.
So that's one reason. The post-war consensus is one reason why people would sound like the student in your class. Another one is the myth of secular neutrality, which I can't believe is still around.
Agreed.
But it is, right? There's just so many people who lie, and whoever tells history in a lot of ways will shape the present. I wish that weren't the case, but it is true. So one of my favorite philosophers, writers, thinkers, he's really a polymath. He was good at a lot of things, was a guy, the late Roger Scruton. And one of the things that he did that just warms my heart and blows my mind is he spent his own time and money going into communist and formerly communist countries to reteach them the history of their own people and of major world events, because the communists had lied to them for so long. They just beat them down, ground them into the dust, and fed them so many lies that their whole worldview was fundamentally askew. Right. So history matters. And one of the things that in this conversation matters.
And lies are real, to your point. Again, back to what Christians note is obvious. We do believe there's an enemy. We do believe he's the father of all these lies. And he acts in personal and corporate fashions through societies. And therefore, blindness comes through these lies. Right? So when we're talking about historical education, it's not just heard through the power grid, that all histories are just attempts at social groups. Basically whoever controls history writes the history, determines history. Right. It's not just for the sake of power, if you will.
Exactly.
But essentially it's for sake of clarity. And this is how lies permeate society to its detriment. This is how truth and God's good news actually permeate for its flourishing.
And Satan hates special revelation, but he also hates natural law.
Oh, that's right.
So I mean, any truth anywhere is his intention done.
Yes, this is where we see pervasively, to your point, don't lose the thread, Doug, is because this is where we see the pervasive celebration. This is the end of the degradation or the devolution in Romans 1. That eventually, even when it comes to things like God's created order and natural law, that which is self-evidently good, we call evil, and what is self-evidently evil, we begin to call good. So this is why the mutilation of Imago Dei in young girls and boys, and even adults, is affirmed as a liberty and a societal right, not a wrong, for folks to actually mutilate themselves.
Right.
And that's somehow protected.
Right. So the myth of secular neutrality is in a catchphrase is separation of church and state. All right, which is number one, not in our Constitution. Just a reminder for anybody who's ignorant of that. The phrase, the separation of church and state, is not in our Constitution. It was coined by Thomas Jefferson, right, in the letter to the Danbury Baptists. If you know your history, you already know all that.
That's
for you. All right.
But most don't, to your point. I remember when I started reading into these things, a lot of that is just overlooked. So these axiomatic dogmas or cliches or phrases that are just thrown around as self-evident, this is how it's always been, or this is how things are established, is just not true.
That's right. So number one, it's not even in the Constitution. Number two, what is in the Constitution, the First Amendment, begins with the word Congress. It says Congress shall not make a law establishing, right, or enfranchising, disenfranchising a particular religion or sect of religion.
Yep.
And we have court cases from history where they are interacting with specific cases to try to apply this law, this general principle. And you can go and read what they said. I'm talking like from the early 1800s when the ink is still almost wet on the First Amendment. You can go and read what they say about this. And what they do not say is, a government should be secular and neutral in religious matters. Nobody who wrote the First Amendment believed that, because at the time when it was written, most states had formal religious tests for public office.
Right.
You couldn't hold public office if you disagreed that the Bible was Christian scriptures, if you denied the Trinity, basic things like that.
Yep.
So when they wrote these words, put them in context. These were not men who were writing it because they thought it would be bad for government to have anything to do with religion. That's not what they were doing. What they were doing, if you know your history, is they were worried about government privileging a particular sect of religion because they had just left England.
Right.
The Church of England said, this church and only this church, not the Puritans, not the nonconformists, definitely not the Baptists and the Catholics, just the Church of England is the official church in England. Right. It wasn't some kind of mere Christendom, right? Yeah. That's not the problem. The problem was they wanted a particular denomination to be the official church that was privileged. So we have these laws that were called disestablishmentarian laws.
It's worth historical, again, a lot of Christians are struggling for reliable sources to go to read in terms of what exactly the theological content in regards to the establishment of religion. To your point, it was not to have the establishment of a particular sect of the Christian religion, meaning Christian denominations. But it was, the theological content was assumed implicit and explicitly throughout most of the documents, the various laws, whether state constitutional laws or precedent in various ways, that was still referring to, and even at that time, Protestant Christian religion.
It was. If you want to read more about that,
Miles' book is wonderful.
He's great. He's done a lot of study on establishmentarianism and disestablishmentarianism in the history of the U.S., and he advocates for the creation of Christian institutionalism. So
it's a great
history
book.
of that, of what.
But this is to your point, Doug. There is no such thing as neutrality. There's no such thing as just secular neutrality or apolitical neutrality.
So it's not even true historically.
Right.
Literally, that was not true. Right. And it's also not true philosophically. Just to give a historical example, I think I've read this before in the talk we did on the articles that we wrote about politics, but just worth reading the first sentence from Abraham Lincoln's Proclamation 97. So he's president. It's March 30th, 1863. Whereas the Senate, listen to every word here, the Senate of the United States devoutly recognizing the supreme authority and just government of Almighty God in all the affairs of men and of nations, has by resolution requested the president to designate and set apart a day for national prayer and humiliation. And whereas it is the duty of nations as well as of men to their own dependence upon the overruling power of God to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yada, yada, yada. He goes on, he talks about the Holy Scriptures and proven by history that those nations are blessed whose God is the Lord.
Right.
That was not that long ago.
Right.
1863 is not that long ago. And you know what's already on the books at that time? First Amendment. You know what was not in anybody's minds at that time? Oh, the state should never be religious or have anything to say about Christianity. That's not true. I think multiple people have their own spin on this, but the best way to kill the myth of secular neutrality is to point out, number one, There is no such thing as neutrality. You're gonna have an opinion on God, on religion, on all those things. Philosophically, there's just no such thing as a view from nowhere when it comes to religion.
Yep.
Number two, historically, it was always some form of mere Christianity, Protestant Christianity in America that was the dominant, cohesive religious element.
Yeah, so it wasn't a debate of which religion to promote.
No,
it was how to best promote the Christian religion for the common good of all people.
We're not going to be one denomination.
So
that's correct.
What we mean by separation of church and state, therefore, is that we don't want the state doing the church's job and the church doing the state's job.
That's right.
I have not been entrusted by God with lethal punishment, as a means of dealing with those who do wrong.
You're not the governor.
Has been given the sword.
That's right.
Not me. Right. Or to contemporize it, the gun. Or the electric chair, or lethal injections, or whatever. The state has that power. That's why cops carry guns, and that's why they punish those who do wrong when they break the law. That's the state's job. It's not my job. My job, their job, is not to say Presbyterians are wrong and Baptists are right. But it is. But the separation of church and state is not the same thing as the separation of religion and politics. And people who think they are will say you're free to have whatever views you want, but you can't bring them into the ballot box, which is insane. Everybody takes their views to the ballot box. And you ought to take your views into the ballot box, because you ought to be saying, I want the nation that I live in to confess Christ as Lord and pass laws in accordance with something like the Ten Commandments to the highest possible ability.
You should back up one and say you ought to go to the ballot box.
You should. You absolutely should. And the Ten Commandments were, by the way, when you read most of these guys, when that would be one of the critiques, is they would say, well, what exactly does that look like? If you're saying they're not like deciding between Baptists and Presbyterians and Anglicans and this, but they are allowed to talk about religion, what does it look like? Christ is Lord. That's what you heard in Proclamation 97. That nation is blessed whose God is the Lord, the overruling power of Jesus Christ, that kind of stuff. So the affirmation that Christ is Lord and the 10 Commandments, all 10 of them, not just the back 5, as the basis for how to govern a particular society, which is why some states still have blasphemy laws on the books.
Blue laws.
Most states did until the 1960s. Even the most liberal states in America still had blasphemy laws on the books until the 1960s. Nobody in history ever thought these things were at odds with one another until, again, much more modern time.
Yeah, a lot of the reasons of the church is struggling with this particular issue of how to think about these things is because they haven't done their historical homework well. So you have a lot of folks just carte blanche dismissive, saying, "Oh, it was never about the Christian religion. It was just about some version of pluralism of all religions as being morally equivalent, and therefore America from its founding was to promote any old religion in any old expression as anybody seems fit. And therefore that will work towards the flourishing of society." Historically, that's just wrong.
And it's like anachronistic reductionism. Reading back into
governmentally, socially, it lands in utter division and chaos and the tearing apart of nations.
That's right. Agreed. So those are the first two, right? People's kind of basic stance and orientation toward this discussion is, well, that sounds like Christian nationalism, which I've been told is wrong, immoral, and harmful. The reason that's their default assumption is they've lived on the other side of the post-war consensus with all of its disdain for the kind of love that we talked about for one's own family more than another, one's own tribe, one's own nation, that kind of thing. So the post-war consensus is one strike. Strike 2 was the myth of secular neutrality and this horrific abuse of what really is meant by the separation of church and state, which is not the separation of religion and politics. And again, historical ignorance contributes to this significantly. And then the third one would be the rise of the gospel-centered movement brought to the fore a way of thinking about Christianity that, though no one would ever say so from their mouth, they function as if laws are intrinsically problematic, intrinsically bad, and in the way that and we've done whole episodes on that, so I won't rehash all that, but the way that it intersects with this particular discussion is they would say, if you pass Christian laws that say that Christ is Lord and that businesses should be closed on Sunday and this and this and this and this and this, then that's legalism, and it's going to hurt missions. It's going to hurt the witness of the church.
Not neighbor love.
Right. That's what they would say.
Right.
And the point is, that's not how the Lord saw it.
Yeah. I mean,
he had all kinds of laws that he said that when sojourners and aliens were living in the community of Israel, they had to abide by them.
Yeah.
Now, what he didn't do is coerce their belief. He didn't say force them to worship Yahweh on pain of death. He didn't do that. He just said, if you want to live here among my people in this nation, then you're not allowed to blaspheme Yahweh. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to, and there's a number of things they could not do. And nobody forced them to live there. They could live anywhere they want. And if they do live there, then they just abide by a certain set of basic laws, and people leave them alone. So we're not talking about coercing atheists to believe.
Sure, yeah.
We're just saying there's certain laws. These laws conform to the Ten Commandments. They're actually good,
right?
Because God doesn't
in a
give
nation
bad
ordered
laws.
towards God.
That's right.
Well, most of the 20th century, and I think this is why it's very difficult for folks. Most of the 20th century saw evangelical retreat.
Mm-hmm.
So the evangelical churches, amongst most broadly evangelical Protestant denominations, moved out of the public square, moved out of the civil square, and continued to retreat back into their local churches, their denominations, and their personal enclaves, their pietistic enclaves.
Aaron Wren's done good work on that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So to your point, you come along, a lot of the which we've lived through this point, a lot of the gospel centering, if you will, I think on its best day ended up being a wonderful attempt to let's recapture the heart of the matter, which is we do have good news in Christ. We have good news for the world, and it transforms individuals and makes people new. Absolutely.
Yep.
We all believe that, but it also was far downstream of a retreat in general of evangelicalism and a refusal to actually bring the good news of the kingdom to bear in every area of life comprehensively. So areas such as civil governments, areas such as education, areas such as vocation in terms of how businesses should be operated, areas such as communities and how they're organized, even in terms of families and what their lifestyle should consist of. The church continued to say, we're not going to speak to that.
Yeah,
Christ doesn't speak to that. Doesn't speak to this. It doesn't speak to this. Where reductionistically boiled down to only affirming a new felt heart.
Exactly.
With your personal kind of like preferential way of walking that out devotionally as you see fit.
Right.
So Christianity became a lifestyle choice per your discretion, not according to biblical standards. So a lot of that retreat over a long time makes this conversation very difficult because we've lost a comprehensive gospel proclamation of the good news of Christ as King of Kings.
Right.
And his kingdom is the kingdom over all kingdoms, and it is the kingdom in which all other kingdoms should submit. Like if you ask basic Christians, if you read these things in the scriptures, they would say, oh, I'll see that. But in terms of exegeting or explaining the meaning in terms of its impact, in terms of how this relates to proclaiming the gospel, and this is intrinsic to what it means to be Christians, and we have a long heritage that accords with understanding the scriptures rightly, applying to these areas, they're just unaware. So I think to your point, people feel, we're not supposed to speak to these things. But actually, that's the result of an extremely malformed Christian.
Agreed.
And a miseducation in terms of biblical teachings and Christian history.
Yeah.
So this great book came out, not a great book. It's actually a really not great book. But, Andy Stanley, not in it to win it. While choosing sidelines to church a lot. So this is a book that echoes Christians should not speak to any of these things. In fact, Jesus has nothing to do with those things. All of that is just a grab bag of personal preference. And anybody who speaks to those is divisive. So in reality, the divisive one is the one who refuses to affirm Christian doctrines. This was recently too by Caleb Campbell, Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. One of the things that's very apparent tragically throughout the book in many ways is what it actually boils down to at many parts of the argument is he does not want to affirm basic Christian teaching. That certain things like abortion is murder of a human being in the womb. That's just basic Christian doctrine. All individuals from point of conception all the way through the end of life are made in God's image and therefore afforded those rights of protection and of the body.
Yes.
Even in the womb. So he just doesn't want to affirm those things. So he sees that as politicizing the gospel, if you will. And it goes on, where ultimately he's just denying basic biblical teaching.
Yeah, so this is all bound up. Take all three of the things we mentioned earlier, the post-war consensus with the foundational unit being the individual, universal human rights is the goal for all nations, not thinking in terms of loyalties to families, tribes, nations, all that stuff. Take the myth of secular neutrality, and then take the gospel-centered misunderstanding of the righteous use of the law and the goodness of righteous rulers promoting good laws, whether people in their heart of hearts believe them or not. Take it all and put it together, and what you get is exactly the situation we're living in, where people are arguing about things like rights and saying stuff like, well, a man should have the right to go into a woman's restroom if he wants to.
Right.
There's so many problems with that. One is it's a misunderstanding of what a right is, and who gives rights. All actual rights come from God.
Yeah, and not to turn a bad cliche, rights have to be right.
That's correct.
Or they're actually what we would call wrongs.
Second problem here is they just misunderstand. They're just naive and not thinking clearly. Does a woman have a right to go into a woman's restroom without the fear of a man being present? Right, who might? So it's funny, right? Because the society is conflicting. On the one hand, you have other feminists who were saying things like, "I would rather be alone with a grizzly bear than with a man because men have done so much harm to women." I'm like, okay, cool. I think you're insane because you don't know about a grizzly bear. But let's just on the face of it, what you're trying to say is men have hurt a lot of women in the world.
Sure,
that's true. It's unfortunate. It's true. It shouldn't be the case. It's ungodly. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the person really believes that. They really believe that a man is more dangerous than a grizzly bear. Cool. Why are you now letting him into a women's restroom then?
That's right.
You see what I'm saying? It is idiotic. It is idiotic and conflicted. And so this is just the way that you deal with this kind of stuff. Do you have a right to play music that's louder than jet noise at 2 a.m.? Or does your neighbor have a right to be able to go to sleep without somebody interfering with that at 2 a.m. by playing music louder than a certain decibel level?
All of these,
and you have to adjudicate that. And then the question is, who gets to say and on what basis, right? On what standard?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Doug Wilson has said that many times over and over again. By what standard is the question? On what basis do we adjudicate how we are to live as a society?
Right. And we need to think through that. I mean, the evangelism argument even falls short. So if you say, I want to see, as Paul says, all types of people converted.
I do.
I do. So, but then, as a friend of mine says, render unto God what's God, render unto Caesar what's Caesar. What happens when Caesar's converted? And we should all want Caesar to be converted.
Absolutely.
It's like I want all people to meet Jesus, but when the politicians meet Jesus, I don't want them to rule or legislate or execute in a Christian way.
Sure.
So it's if you want people to meet Christ, you want them to live out of their relationship and the lordship of Christ. They're going to do that in distinctively Christian ways. But you have to say, well, I want evangelism, but not too much.
Yeah. Well, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of who Christ is.
Right.
This is getting back to the basics of Christianity. Christ is Lord. He is the creator God. He's the one who stepped into history. He's the one who died and rose. He's the one who reigns. So by definition, he's the one who establishes what is good. Mm-hmm. Anybody who says, well, I don't want people promoting what God says is good, doesn't actually have the good in mind for anyone. So Christians, by definition, shouldn't even be a question. Should we want governing authorities and everyone to promote what Christ says is wonderful? Well, yes, of course. That's what discipling the nations looks like. And that's not opposed to evangelism, because again, the law of Christ, which is actually good in and of itself, everywhere that it has impact, actually leads us to see our need for it and need to repent and turn to him. So it's not opposed to conversion mission, gospel mission, folks from all walks of life coming to Christ, because the universal lordship of all authority has been given unto me is actually part of the good news that leads everybody to walk away from the confusion. Without Christ, you just have chaos, as Doug Wilson said many times, and then you have no way to actually adjudicate. To your point of how do we actually understand what it means to be neighbors? What are we actually working towards in our neighbors? What does it mean to be an individual? What are families? What are we actually to be striving after? None of those questions are able to be answered without establishing by what standard and according to whose rule. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it has to be Christ.
There's another objection that comes up. It just occurred to me where some would say, yeah, but when this kind of thing's been tried before, it hasn't gone well.
Sure.
You do
you do hear this, right? I'm excited to hear your answer.
And back to this. One would be, well, just think about the authority and responsibility that God has given to parents and especially fathers, right? Ephesians 6:4, fathers, bringing up your children in discipline and instruction of the Lord. All fathers will one day, even non-Christians, will stand before Christ, the judge of all, and give an account for whether or not they brought their children up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. They will.
Sure.
And that's that's basic Christian teaching. So what if somebody says, yeah, but there are bad dads out there? I would say there are. And it's going to go very badly for them on the day of judgment. What that doesn't do is say, because there are bad dads out there, we should remove the parents' authority and responsibility to disciple their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, because some get it wrong.
That's right.
So we do the same thing with civil magistrates, right? With political rulers. We say, God instituted these authorities, Romans 13:1. He made them a minister of his justice, Romans 13:4. He told them to promote what is good and punish what is evil, 1 Peter 2. Therefore, just because some have done it poorly doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it at all. That's even worse in some ways.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Which is where we are now.
I love that answer too. Christians are very too quick to not understand the enemy's tactics. He loves being an accuser.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever bears the accusation also bears the burden of proof, is how they put in polemics class, right? So the person who says, well, there's been too much things that have gone wrong when Christians ruled too thickly. I'll say, well, that's wonderful. Well, let's assess when they didn't rule.
Yeah.
So you had hypocritical Christian rulers, and of course they went askew. That doesn't affirm the opposite of that, which is atheistic, social Darwinian, genocidal maniacs throughout the 20th century that had no reference to God.
Right.
So if we just want to stack body count, if that's what we want to do,
that's easy.
Christianity still wins by a long
that's easy.
shot.
So yeah, one of the classic
shot.
canards that gets brought up is Calvin's Geneva burned Servetus at the stake. I'm like, it sure did. So here's the thing: when Christians like Calvin ruled Geneva, occasionally heretics were burned at the stake.
Sure.
And sometimes there were people in history who were burned at the stake that weren't heretics.
That's right.
The Catholic Church disagreed and thought they were, and they put them to death.
Right.
Well, that stinks and shouldn't have happened. But we're talking about figures that you could count on your hands and toes the number of times these kinds of things happened, versus millions of babies who are killed every year.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hundreds and tens of thousands of bodies of children that are mutilated by surgeries and drugs and all kinds of things to try to do the impossible and become a different sex than what their chromosomes actually say.
Yeah,
right. I mean, just go down the line.
List.
It is an insane comparison.
Well,
it's insane.
A lot of it ends up being a red herring in the overall argument, because ultimately everybody's going to grab whatever statistics and is going to cobble together their rationalizations descriptively. But it still begs the question: by what standard?
Mm-hmm.
What does it actually look? What is the standard by which all rulers are judged by, whether they claim to be Christian rulers or non-Christian rulers? God's standard, Christ's standard, does not change, and that's the only basis by which we say that guy was bad. Yeah. I don't care if he claimed to be a Christian or not. That guy was an unjust ruler.
Absolutely.
Look at a lot of the Israelite kings. Right, they're in there as examples of positive ones like David, and then a whole slew of ones that are varying degrees of bad.
Yeah.
Some of the kings said, I'm kind of down with some of the high places. We'll leave them up there.
Right.
Then you have the Jezebel and Ahabs come along and just say, you know what? It's full religious pluralism. Mm-hmm. Let's just party with all the idols and see how this goes. And of course, God judged them because it creates chaos and detriment and injustice for everyone. So it still is a red herring from the overall discussion on what grounds are rulers judged and what's the basis. So come a full circle, we still get back to governments exist to promote true religion. Christianity is the true religion. So how should the government actually promote these things? And what's the church's role or Christians' roles in helping encourage the government towards those ends, witnessing to the governments about what their role is, reminding them, prophetically proclaiming to them what they're to be about.
Discipling those who are members of our congregation.
Right.
Absolutely.
So how is actually Christianity upheld and affected? I think is part of the conversation. A lot of the literature actually weighs in as well.
We could chase that right now. I'd love to hear the counsel you would give to pastors. We've covered a ton in an hour.
Sure.
And if they, pastors are busy, they're making hospital visits, they're preparing sermons, they're raising up new leaders, they're doing all the things that pastors do. They don't have 40 hours a week to invest in this topic, but it is necessary and good for them. Maybe some of the things that came up in this conversation were like, I need to think more about that.
Right.
So what would be your counsel to a pastor who realizes he needs to start making some progress and getting his thoughts straight so he can better disciple his congregation?
Doug's looking up a verse going to be better than what I'm about to say, but one comment I would make is things that pastors already know, and this is a really colloquial way to say it, but you need to embrace the gooder news.
Yeah,
there's gooder news than that you already know about that you need to actually proclaim that gooder news. Meaning the good news of Christ and His kingdom is comprehensive and whole. What you actually have been probably preaching is a very narrow Christ who's only Lord of particular feelings and the church and sentiments and hearts.
Right.
And the only change that He brings is taking you positionally into His kingdom. He does not change all of your life towards Christ and all of your neighborhoods and all nations towards Christ. Begin proclaiming the good news as it actually is.
The gooder news.
Herald the gooder news. and see, it's terrible, but see that, essentially see what happens, because then folks get a grand vision that Christ is King of Kings. That becomes the proper purview for which we inquire. Now, how do we do this in a way that honors Him, but brings about His kingdom? How do we do those things?
You've already said some. Obviously, you're discipling members of your congregation who may work in the civil or political sphere. You are also calling out errors that occur at the national level, which means that to do this, pastors are going to have to make their peace with the fact that there will be people who say to them, you're being political.
Yeah.
And there's two ways you can answer that. One is you could say, this is what you would do. It's darn right I am, because the gospel's intrinsically political.
I don't say darn right.
Right? Something like that. This is Acts 17.
Yes, to your point, one answer, which I do employ typically, is, there's nothing that's not political.
Yes.
So let's broaden our horizons and embrace what actually is going on here.
Yes.
So there's not an area that doesn't deal with politics.
Right. Another way to answer it would be to say, actually what I'm doing is I'm preaching the truth. And the implications of this particular truth do have political ramifications. Right. So Acts 17:6, these men, the crowds are upset because the apostles are preaching in Athens and the surrounding areas. And they come together. They say, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here too. They are all acting contrary to Caesar's decrees, saying there is another king, Jesus.
Right.
Now, if the Christian message is there actually is a king above the president, and to whom the president's accountable, and every congressman and every senator and every judge and every mayor and every school board official, there is a king and they will answer to him, right? Then part of what the preaching looks like is recognizing, hey, when I get to a passage that talks about something that our current political rulers are getting wrong, I just point that out for our people in the hopes that at a bare minimum, they would vote for somebody different next time.
Yeah.
At a bare minimum. Vote for somebody better, right? At a bare minimum. And even if they don't listen, then we go down like Jeremiah, telling people the truth that maybe they don't want to hear, but their blood isn't on our hands because we've done what we could to point them to what is good and right and true in the hopes that they would embrace it.
It's great. Yeah. Let God's word speak, and He'll sift out the nations. That we believe these things. Also, as a pastor, which all pastors kind of know this in theory, but begin to exercise just a good pastoral backbone, and realize that if the scriptures are true, which of course they are, and descriptively, this is what good Christian ministry looks like, which we see especially through the New Testament and the book of Acts, there's going to be a lot of people upset. So a lot of people are going to say, this is beautiful. Thank you. I love this. What grace, what clarity. And then idols will be overturned. Flesh will be put to death. And a lot of people will not agree. They will not be excited. they will be frustrated. So a litmus test of, is your ministry going well, is not, am I frustrating everybody?
No.
Right.
But nor is it, does everybody agree?
Right.
And the reality is, no, a lot of people are going to agree, a lot of people are going to disagree, but we all need to agree with Christ.
Yeah. And related to this, I would say they need to recognize that politics is not, it never could be, but it's not sealed off from every other aspect of discipleship, as if your job is just to get people to do better at reading their Bible and praying, but you're not supposed to be thinking about how they how they have thoughts and spend their lives in other arenas. That's an insane view of discipleship. Discipleship should be equally comprehensive to the lordship of Jesus. And if he's Lord of every area of our life, then he should be Lord of how we're voting too. That means, just to put, not to find a point on it, but I'm going to do it anyway, is if there's a member of your congregation who says, yeah, well, I mean, just for me, I'm a Christian, but I think abortion is a fundamental human right. It's healthcare or whatever. That person's wrong and needs to be discipled into the truth.
Yep.
You can go to the verses of the Bible and say murder is wrong. Here's the basic definition of murder according to God. Abortion meets that criteria. Therefore, it is wrong. Therefore, you should not vote for anybody who openly celebrates what God says is wicked, immoral, and wrong. You shouldn't.
And that's so basic.
What I mean is really basic.
It's not even controversial according to the scriptures. That's helping us. God comes in and transforms our actions, our habits, our thoughts, our affections. Everything is subject to him, and therefore what it was can be no more.
And this, so
you may have, I believed a lot of things before I became a Christian. And then coming to Christ, I had a lot and still have a lot that he is upending and changing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's because he actually gets to say.
In some ways, the elephant in the room here, which we haven't mentioned his name so far, so I'm just going to do it anyway, is that Trump really broke people's brains when it comes to this, because what then someone will say when you point out that abortion is obviously, according to the Lord, wicked, immoral, dastardly, vile, and somebody will come back and say, so is Trump. And there's multiple ways you can handle that. One is to say, that's fine. If you think that, don't vote for him either. Cool. You want to vote? You want to vote third party? Your conscience, you've got to follow your conscience. And if you think these people are equally vile and immoral and backwards and wrong, okay.
Yeah.
But what you can also do is say, you're right. There's a lot of things about his life that is extremely out of line with God's word.
Right.
Is it equally bad, equally out of line with someone who's running against him, who is openly celebrating and endorsing certain policies that are demonstrably more harmful than what he's about? Now, that's a debate, but it's a debate that can be had. And it's within Christian purview for somebody to make a calculus and say, I think he is far from the ideal Christian ruler that the Bible talks about.
Sure.
Far from it. And yet, still far better than any other viable alternative that's running against him. And therefore, while he is not the goal, he is not the finish line, he's not even close to where we ought to be, he might get us a little closer than another candidate would, who certainly is going to take us even further away from God's word in this point.
Yeah, what this example brings up also is how ill-focused the church is. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is we do have a president, we do have a civil ruler who is ultimate in a lot of ways, and we as citizens rightly exercise our rights in a democratic society to cast a vote once every 4 years, if you will, for that particular president. So our duty to love and contribute to promoting what is good in that particular office is casting that one vote. Now what are you going to do for the remainder of the 4 years? 365 days within those years, 24 hours within those days. How are you promoting the goodness of Jesus where you are? How that doesn't happen is for the next 4 years, you to just talk about politics and never love anybody, never actually serve, never sacrifice, never reach your neighbor, never promote businesses, never function as a good citizen in your community, never actually work as a good employee within your business. The salt of the earth permeates down in the day-to-day of life. And so we get the imbalance is demonstrated by everybody gets very worked up by what you just brought up. But nobody's getting worked up where the actual day-to-day work of kingdom life and kingdom mission actually is accomplished.
The fact of Jesus being king over all things.
That's right.
And so if you hear us making the argument that Jesus is king over politics and rulers and nations, that's true. But he's also king of your family and your finances and your vocation and what you do in your church and what you do tonight at 8:32 and what you do tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. and whatever those are. So you need to operate under the total kingship and allegiance to Jesus.
Yeah. The only thing I would say in response to what you said is also there's a lot of other elections that happen before that.
That's right.
Everything you said is right about the necessity of daily obedience and honoring the Lord with everything He's entrusted to you. Right. All 100% correct. I just want people to know, because this was a penny drop for me. It's so basic. It's embarrassing to even say I never thought of it. But after doing some of the reading from the books that we've got here on this table, somebody just pointed out, politics is an extension of neighbor love. Sure. That's what it is. You are, or it's what it ought to be. When you are fighting to make it illegal for men to go in a women's restroom, you're actually loving women well by keeping either mentally deranged men who think they're women out of the restrooms, or sexual deviants who will use this new policy as a guise to go in there and assault women, abuse little girls, and so on. Politics is an extension of neighbor love. And when you see it in that light, then you don't see it as something extra that we add on to all the stuff that really matters. You see all of it as a comprehensive thing of, I should be loving my neighbors all the time in every way that I can, doing as much good as I can with everything God's entrusted to me. And if He's given me in a democratic society, which the New Testament didn't have, a lot of people are like, well, I don't see any of this in the New Testament. Well, go back to the logical syllogism we started with. You can get there from those principles, but it's also worth pointing out they weren't allowed to vote. If they had written these things at a time when they could vote, you think Paul would have said, guys, don't worry about voting. Just have the most wicked rulers ever. That's not what the Proverbs say. They say when the wicked rule, the people groan. When the righteous increase, they rejoice. So vote that way.
Well, again, if you can vote every day and there's an election, go vote. But also Christians need to hear what you're saying rightly, which is that does not equate to mere awareness raising constantly. No, it's not. It's action. It's awareness with action.
Yes.
So too many Christians would love to do the low hanging, easy, lazy.
Sure. Facebook post here and there.
That's right. I Facebook post every day about awareness, but I don't actively do anything about it. And that's the failure of the church, that it needs to get beyond its hypocrisy to raise awareness, be active in every sphere, contribute rightly in all areas, and it needs to put feet behind what they're doing.
Because most people, the churches do. The Lord hasn't given in His providence most people a platform or like a writing or speaking ministry or anything where their voice will impact those who are actually able to do something.
Right, that's correct.
That's just not. So the most they could do in that realm would be to vote.
That's right.
But which is why what you're saying is so important, because beyond that, there's a lot of other things they can do.
That's right.
Even like small things. I think about this every Sunday when I preach at our church downtown. I walk past a crew of volunteers we have who do nothing but pick up trash for an hour.
Yes. Doggy dirt. It's all over the sidewalks. Magical downtown.
The 3 blocks surrounding where our building is downtown, every week, there are pornographic flyers, beer cans, used condoms, needles, all kinds of junk. It's insane how much trash bags and bags and bags every week. And imagine if we didn't do that, right? If we spent time just writing about littering on the internet and how littering is stupid, immoral, lazy, wrong, makes you a bad citizen. What is wrong with you? You can't just take your trash to a trash can. It's like the most low-hanging fruit. It's insane. The only thing easier than not littering is putting your shopping cart back. And some people still don't do that, right? So we could do that, but that's probably not going to do anything. So we got guys out there. So yes, we would talk about that if a sermon ever came up where littering was appropriate to talk about. But in addition to discipling people well, we actually do something about
Pick up the garbage,
which is amazing. That's just a stupid small example. But I think about the impact. How ridiculous would, if that trash is accumulated for months, how ridiculous would those blocks look? And how much worse would they get? Because broken window theory, right? When things look bad, people feel no qualms about doing more immoral things in those places.
I'm just feeling convicted. I'm guilty of not putting my shopping cart up many times. I'm going to change that. So I'm going to change the world. So what you're
sanctification's a process.
Jordan Peter said, start by making your bed.
There we go.
Start by making your bed. Well, thanks, guys. This has been fun. We have barely scratched the surface of these books, but hopefully had a helpful conversation to those who are listening in, and look forward to the next one.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks.